When the Islamic Iranian Revolution overthrew the current government back in 1979, students in support of the revolution took control of the US Embassy in Tehran, taking most of the American personnel hostage. I say most because 6 managed to escape. And the covert mission to bring them back to the United States? Well, that's the topic of today's video. This is the Canadian Caper. The Islamic Iranian Revolution in 1979 saw the US-based Shah of Iran and his government overthrown and replaced by the Ayatollah Khomeini. In the chaos of revolution, a group of student revolutionaries stormed the US Embassy in Tehran and on the 4th of November 1979 gained control of the embassy and took 52 American diplomats hostage. These 52 hostages would be held at the embassy compound for 444 days, finally being released in 1981 after the signing of the Algiers Accord. However, there were 6 staff that were left unaccounted for, 6 embassy personnel that somehow made it out in the chaos of that night. Actually, there were 2 groups that initially made it out that night. They were all working in the consulate building, which was another separate building on the embassy's compound, but it was the last to be attacked.
Initially, the 6 found refuge in a number of different locations, among them 2 West European embassies. Within a few days, though, they all made their way to the Canadian embassy.
So when the Iranians came over the compound wall, the 2 groups tore out onto the streets of Tehran with the orders of making it to the British embassy. The first group, led by the consul general, took an indirect route and ended up getting caught by a mob and returned to the compound. The second group was led by Robert Anders, and they took a more direct route. But when they got close to the embassy, they saw that there was a large crowd gathering there too, and so they decided to abort that plan. They were close to Robert's apartment, so they decided to go there for the night. Robert escaped that night with Cora Amber Lijek and her husband Mark Lijek, Joseph Stafford, and his wife Kathleen Stafford. The 5 spent the next 6 days hiding and sliding from house to house around Tehran, including going to a British residential compound for a night. But after only 3 days, the group heard that the Shah's government fell, and they knew their ordeal was going to take significantly longer. The revolutionaries would be looking for them if they realized that there were Americans that had escaped. So the question became, where do we hide? And how on earth do we get out of Tehran?
What happened? 6 of the hostages went out a back exit.
Where are they? The Canadian ambassador's house.
Got Revolutionary Guards going door to door.
Anders decided to reach out to an old friend and Canadian diplomat John Sheardown. On November 10th, 6 days since the takeover of the embassy, they got word of an enthusiastic welcome from the Canadians and quickly headed over to their house. There they met with John and his wife Zina, and to their surprise, the Canadian ambassador to Iran, Ken Taylor, was also there to welcome the group. Ambassador Taylor informed the Americans that Canada was going to do everything it could to protect them while in Iran, and to work with the US State Department to get them back home to the United States. It was decided that Rob Anders and the Lijeks were going to stay with John and Zina, and the Staffords would be taken by Ambassador Taylor to stay at their home with his wife Pat. No one knew how long they were going to be hiding, and no one really knew what was happening back at the embassy, how many people were taken hostage, and how many might have escaped. Ambassador Taylor received a phone call a few weeks later from the embassy of Sweden. Apparently, one more American had escaped that night, Henry Lee Schatz, who had been sleeping on the floor of the Swedish embassy ever since. But it wasn't safe for him. The revolutionaries were now looking for escapees, and the Swedish ambassador thought that Lee could better impersonate a Canadian than a Swede if it actually came down to it. And Taylor agreed, sending Schatz to go stay at the Sheardown home. The Canadians would end up harboring the Americans in Tehran for a total of 79 days. But the real story, the true caper, is how we got them out. Ambassador Taylor placed a call back to Ottawa to Flora MacDonald, the Secretary of State for External Affairs, and to Prime Minister Joe Clark for help. They both immediately agreed with the effort to protect the Americans, and they promised to do whatever it took to get them out. The Canadian government worked closely with CIA exfiltration expert Tony Mendez to provide a cover story, documents, and other materials to make the escape possible. First, the Canadian government issued an order in council to official multiple copies of real Canadian passports with different fake identities for each of the 6 American diplomats in Canadian protection. The passports were real, But the CIA would then put a fake Iranian travel visa and an entry stamp into the passport to make it look like they've already been used to get into the country legally. CIA agent Mendez worked closely with Canadian agents in Ottawa to develop the story, and although they made a whole bunch of different identities for a variety of situations, the cover story that was eventually selected had the 6 diplomats pretending to be a Hollywood film crew, out scouting movie locations for a sci-fi film with a set on a planet with a Middle Eastern deserty feel called Argo.
I got an idea.
They're a Canadian film crew for a science fiction movie.
I fly into Tehran. We all fly out together as a film crew. I need you to help me make a fake movie.
So you want to come to Hollywood and act like a big shot without actually doing anything?
Yeah.
You'll fit right in.
Don't get me wrong, Argo was a fake movie, and it was never going to be real, but it was the realest fake movie ever created. To make the cover story believable, Mendez enlisted the help of John Chambers, who was a veteran makeup artist from Hollywood. Together they set up an actual office on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles named Studio 6 Productions, a nod to the 6 diplomats they were working to rescue. They had someone sit in that office just in case anyone called to verify if the movie and the studio were real. They took out ads in LA newspapers, they hosted film parties at LA nightclubs, and they placed posters about the studio and the film in both Variety and Hollywood Reporter magazines, just so that if anyone started to ask questions to anyone in Hollywood, they would probably be like, oh yeah, I've heard of Studio 6, and I think they're making that movie called Argo. This whole time, Canada was playing it cool with the Iranians and pretending nothing was wrong. But in the background, we were making plans to shut down our own embassy in Tehran, we were secretly flying out non-essential staff, and the American diplomats continued to pass their time in hiding playing cards and Scrabble. Tensions started to rise when there was a flurry of activity outside the Canadian embassy, and some suspicious phone calls to both the Taylor and Sherdown residences made them think that they might have been discovered. It was time to go. But just before Mendez and a CIA colleague nicknamed Julio left for Iran, a Canadian staffer in Ottawa realized that they had made a mistake on the fake Iranian visas. The date that they had stamped on the visa was wrong, because the Iranian year starts in the spring and not in January. But luckily they had printed spare passports for everyone and were able to correct the mistake before heading to Iran. Tony Mendez and Julio landed in Tehran in late January 1980, and they headed to the residence of Canadian Ambassador Ken Taylor. There he met with the 6 diplomats, gave them their new Canadian passports and identities, and walked them through the backstory. They were a film crew. They had been in Iran for work, looking for locations for a film, and were headed back to Toronto via Zurich. So early morning on Sunday, January 27th, 1980, Mendez, Julio, and the 6 American diplomats arrived at the Tehran Mehrabad International Airport with their real Canadian passports and their fake Iranian entry visas. But they were able to make it through customs and security quite easily. However, their flight was delayed due to some mechanical difficulties, so they waited nervously, but eventually boarded Swissair Flight 363 and took off for Zurich. The Canadian caper had been pulled off successfully. After 79 days of hiding in the protection of the Canadian embassy in Tehran, the 6 diplomats were out of Iran and off to a CIA safe house in the mountains of Switzerland, free at last. Well, not quite. They were told that they were not going to be able to tell anyone that they were out. They had to protect the other 52 hostages still in Tehran and the networks of people that they were able to use to keep the 6 safe. But that's not what the rest of the world had planned. The very next morning, the moment they caught wind that the diplomats were safe and out of Iran, La Presse de Montréal broke the story on how Canada had protected the American diplomats and gotten them out. The Canadian caper was worldwide news. Canada immediately closed our embassy in Tehran, and Ambassador Ken Taylor and the rest of the staff headed back home, cutting all diplomatic ties to the Ayatollah's government. The 6 diplomats didn't need to be in hiding anymore, so they were brought home to the US and arrived back on American soil on the 30th of January 1980. American crowds gathered around the country to thank Canada for what we had done. It came as a surprise to most, because no one in the public knew that anyone had escaped. Now, they knew that thanks to Canada, 6 diplomats were safe and back in the United States of America. Robert Anders, Mark and Cora Lyjak, Joseph and Kathleen Stafford, and Henry Lee Schatz all made it home that day thanks to the incredible risks taken by their Canadian counterparts. And those Canadians involved were all awarded with the Order of Canada, including Mary O'Flaherty, Roger Lucy, and Laverna Dollimore, who were all embassy staff, John and Zena Sheardown, and Ken and Patricia Taylor. Ambassador Taylor was also awarded the Congressional Gold Medal by the United States Congress for his assistance to the United States of America. If the movie title Argo sounds a little familiar to you, it's because it finally became a real movie back in 2012. Except it wasn't a sci-fi movie about space, it was the story of the Canadian caper, albeit without all the Canadian. The film dramatizes the events and focuses more on the role of the CIA, leaving out a lot of the details about Canada's direct role in making the rescue possible. For example, they completely omitted John and Zena Sheardown for reasons of length and cost, and they put all 6 diplomats at the Taylor residence. The film also states that the British and New Zealand embassies turned the Americans away, and that's not true. They were initially supposed to go to the British embassy, but the crowd outside made that impossible. And by the time they were with the Canadians, the British knew that Iranians were looking for them. So all of our allies in Iran agreed that the Canadians' residences were truly the safest places for them to be. The Canadian caper, or as it's known in the United States, Argo, is one of the most important chapters in the relationship between Canada and the United States. And if you guys want to see more stories about that special relationship between Canada and the US, let us know in the comments below and we'll be sure to make some of those videos. In the meantime, we're excited to see you next week, and bye!